Hello, guys. Welcome to our second week of our events fortnight here at Loughborough, our Christian Union. I'm Rob, and I will be your host for today. And we really hope you enjoyed last week. We've had some great events. Did you guess that I was the murderer? I know I'm a dodgy-looking guy, but did you guess? I obviously had some accomplices as well. But that was a great time. And we had some really good discussions in our lunch bars and escape Zooms. Oh, it was a great week. It was a great week. And we hope you've had a restful weekend because we've got another week. I know, 2 weeks of great events. It's amazing. So yeah, coming up this week, just little teasers. We've got more lunch bars like the one today, which we're going to be talking about some of the deeper questions in life. And we've got 2 evening events. One being an open mic night, where we're going to be displaying our talent. And if you haven't yet entered into that open mic night, you can. DM us on Instagram at Loughborough_CU, or get in touch with Jonah, who's heading up that, if you want to showcase your talent. So that's a really cool opportunity. And then obviously we've got on Friday our pub quiz, and I know it's going to be immense. The quiz masters are, I mean, the best brains in CU, Jack Bradshaw and James, I you guys. Anyway, it will be a really good time. So make sure you get prepared, get some pizzas in so you can whack them in the oven and eat them while you do the quizzes in the future. So today, we're going to have a talk by Andrew Brown. Do you want to come and say hi? Yeah, cool.
Hello.
Nice to be with you. Nice to be with you. And he's going to be talking to us about grief and suffering. Where is God? So it's quite a big question, and it's particularly relevant in these COVID times. So Andrew, do you want to just introduce yourself, say who you are? Yeah,
great. Thanks, Rob. Yeah, so like Rob said, my name's Andrew, and I live here in Loughborough. I'm originally from London, and I came up to the Midlands a number of years ago now. I was a student at the University of Leicester, and I studied maths there. And I now don't do anything with maths at all. I actually work for a local church, a church called Emmanuel Church, which many of you might have walked past heading into town. It's the big kind of old-fashioned looking one on Forest Road. And I work there as the music coordinator, doing musical stuff for the church, including kind of online services, which we've been doing a lot of over the last year. So yeah, that's a bit about who I am and what I do.
Cool. That sounds really interesting. I'm sure it's busy.
It is, yeah.
The online stuff.
Yeah, it's busy learning new things as well. About 12 months ago, when everything went online, it was like, oh, we're not doing services just in church anymore. I've got to learn how to make videos and edit them and upload them and stream them. So yeah, it's been busy, it's been interesting, but I enjoy it. It's good.
Well, it's lovely that that you're here with us today, and I'm very excited to hear what you've got to say to us. Andrew's actually also kindly agreed to do a quick Q&A after the talk, guys. So you can submit your questions into Slido, as you can see on the screen now, with the hashtag purpose 20 seconds. And so on this website, you can upvote other people's questions, and then the ones with the most upvotes will be easiest for me to see, but I will be looking through and finding out some questions. So do use that resource. It's been really good so far. So yeah, and don't be shy. It can be anonymous. So if you've got any big questions that you just feel like you need to ask, go on to that. So yeah, if you're here and you've seen the title of the talk about grief and suffering, and you're someone who has suffered from losing a loved one or has felt grief before, I really hope that this next session and this time will help with your thinking on that and spur maybe conversations with some people in the Christian Union that may have invited you, or within the Christian Union community itself. And also, if you haven't actually experienced any loss in your life, thankfully so far, we just really hope this time would be a good preparation for when this does happen, because we are living in the world, and suffering and grief does occur. So yeah, hope you guys really enjoy, and I'm going to stop waffling and hand over to Andrew. So thank you guys. Over to you, Andrew.
Great, thanks so much, Rob. Yeah, so it's really great to be here and speaking with you guys this afternoon rather. So as Rob introduced us, this topic is grief and suffering. Where is God? And it's a really big question, isn't it? It's a question that's both timeless and also timely. It's a question that will have been asked by people all throughout history. But with the events of the past 12 months, it's become a much more pertinent question again. Where is God when 2.5 million people die in a year from a new virus? And to add to that, the suffering that has come as a result of extended lockdowns, such as increased job losses, poverty, mental health crisis. Before I get into tackling this question, let me just outline a little bit where I'll be going in this talk, and hopefully that'll be helpful for you to follow as we go along. I think that there are two aspects to the problem of suffering. Firstly, we've got the kind of philosophical or intellectual problem of suffering. In other words, that's the thinking about, given that suffering exists in the world, logically, how can we also have a loving and powerful God also existing? So that's part number one. And secondly, we've also got the experiential problem. Many of you here may not find it hard to believe in the Christian God because of the apparent philosophical problem, but rather because you have personally experienced suffering or grief yourself. And maybe your reaction to that experience has been, how could a loving God let this happen? I think that both of these ways of engaging with the problem of suffering are valid ones, as we as humans attempt to make sense of suffering. And what I hope to do in this talk is show you that actually, I think the reality of suffering is not evidence against Christianity, but rather when confronted with the problem of suffering, I actually believe that Christianity offers us the best answers, but also the best hope as well. So that's where we're going to go with this. So first up, the philosophical or the intellectual problem of suffering. I remember when I did my GCSE RE a number of years ago now, being confronted with a seemingly watertight argument that supposedly disproved my faith in the Christian God. You're probably familiar with it too. It goes something like this. If God is all loving, then he wants to stop suffering. If God is all powerful, then he is able to stop suffering. But since suffering exists, there cannot be an all-loving and powerful God. As a Christian, this is surely a big problem for me. I do believe in a God who is totally loving, a God who surely hates suffering and wants it to end. I also believe in a God who is all-powerful, a God who surely has the capability to end all suffering. Well, shouldn't it seem obvious then that the existence of suffering in the world is the nail in the coffin of the Christian idea of God? So why are we even bothering to tackle this topic today? Does COVID, mental health struggles, cancer, the death of innocent and loved ones not prove the idea of the Christian God to be false? If there was a good God, then all this bad stuff simply wouldn't happen, would it? So where do we go from here? Well, I think that it's true to say that when we as human beings see and hear of terrible things happening, when we ourselves experience heartache and depression and loss, there's something inside of us that tells us this is wrong. The world ought not be this way. And for many people, the logical conclusion is that because of this, because there is so much wrong, there must not be a good and powerful God. This is what logic seems to dictate, right? But my question is this: if we assume this logic to be correct, where does this leave us? How do we make sense of a world of suffering if there is no good and powerful God? I think a common reaction to the existence of suffering is to conclude that there is no God at all, whether the Christian God or otherwise, and that this is what makes most sense of the world of suffering we are confronted with. And this may be what some of you have concluded. Well, if then to deal with the problem of suffering, we turn to a view of the world with no God, how does this view of the world account for the reality of suffering? Does a view of the world without God deal satisfactorily with the problem of suffering? Does it show us that in the light of suffering, there is no good and powerful God, that the God of the Bible cannot exist? Well, I think one thing that we need to consider when we think about this is that if there really is no God, then there is really no reason or meaning behind the existence of the world, or me, or you. The world and everyone in it, and the events that happen to us just come by pure chance. There cannot be any rhyme or reason to anything that happens, whether that's a really good, great thing or a really terrible thing. The world and everyone in it would merely be atoms spinning around with no ultimate purpose. In this view of the world, why do good things happen to bad people? They get lucky. And why do bad things happen to good people? They get unlucky. Why is there pain and suffering? That's just the way things are. Does that really satisfy us when we are faced with the realities of pain? If suffering is just part of the random nature of this world, then why do we feel that it is just so wrong? If pain is just bad luck, why do we still see and experience it and feel that it is not right? Why do we think that the world ought not be this way? Why, when we hear of things like children being killed, do we say that this is inherently wrong? Do you see that there is an inconsistency here? To be consistent with a view of the world without a God, we aren't allowed to say that the world is not as it should be. Moreover, we aren't even really allowed to say that anything is objectively wrong. If we are to say that there are objective right and wrong, then there has to be some sort of external standard to determine this, something or someone to give these objective values of right and wrong. Something outside of this material world, beyond the mere spinning atoms. But a view of the world that does not have a God does not allow for this. It does not allow for anything outside of the material world. Let me ask you this. Do you see or even experience the suffering in the world and react to that by thinking that this is wrong that this happens? Well, if you do, this should lead you to see that a world without a God is inconsistent with how we as human beings actually experience the world we live in. You see, what I'm saying is this, that initially, and admittedly quite understandably, we often see suffering as the big blow to the belief in God. But in fact, the way in which we as humans view and experience pain and suffering actually points us to the existence of something or someone outside of ourselves, outside of this material world, something that has to be powerful, something that has to be moral, perhaps some sort of God. But surely you may say to me that, okay, if there is a God, if we do require some sort of God to be consistent with the reality of suffering, surely this God can't be both good and loving. Surely we've disproved that already, right? But this good and loving God, that's the Christian claim. So how can the Christian view of the world make sense of this apparent contradiction, this contradiction that on one hand, we seem to have disproved logically a good and loving God in the light of suffering, but on the other hand, we seem to require some sort of God to make sense of how we view and experience suffering? Well, as I've pointed out, we as human beings, we see suffering in the world. And whether that's a conscious thought or just unconsciously, we think and feel that this is not how things ought to be. And you know what? That is exactly what the Bible says. If you're someone who sees suffering in the world and you think and feel, this is not how the world ought to be, then you agree with the Bible. You see, contrary to how it first seems, the existence of suffering isn't a problem to the Christian view of the world. The Christian view of the world actually makes perfect sense of suffering, because the Christian understanding of the world, the Christian view of the world cries out, you're right. This is not how the world ought to be. This suffering, this pain, it is wrong. Let me explain how I mean that. Right at the beginning of the Bible, when God creates the world is described as good. It's a place without pain and without suffering. Christianity says that the world was not made to be a place with pain and suffering. God did not create it to be this way. And this is precisely why we feel that the world ought not be this way, because it was not intended to be this way. The reason that suffering entered the world is because mankind chose to reject God. And instead of living fulfilled in a relationship with him, we have chosen to live our own way apart from him. The Bible calls this sin, and the consequences of choosing to sin is a world where we all experience pain and suffering. So the fact that pain and suffering entered the world is not actually a philosophical problem when you have the Christian view of the world, because we see pain and suffering as not what was meant to exist. We also see it as what we expect to see in a world that is broken, inhabited by broken people. Okay, so this may very well explain why suffering and pain came in the first place, but this begs the question, why is it still here? If this God who created the perfect but now broken world is a good and loving and powerful God, surely God would have dealt with suffering by now. Well, this is where I am forced to say that the Christian God cannot exist in a world of suffering. Let me say that again, because I think it's quite a surprising thing to hear me say. The Christian God cannot exist in a world of suffering. And that is exactly why he is doing something about it. The Bible tells us what we all sense should be the case, that because God is a God of love, and because he can't stand the suffering in this world, and because he is powerful and he is able to, he does do something about it. Like I said, in the beginning of the Bible, we read about a world that was created without suffering. But we read to the end of the Bible, we read of another world without suffering. The Bible tells us that this world that we live in will not stay as it is forever. It was never meant to be this way, and it will not stay this way either. As Christians, we believe that one day God will come and make this world we live in new again, and there'll no longer be any pain or any suffering. That's a wonderful hope. But what about in the meantime? Why are we still waiting for that day to come? Well, if, like I said, the root cause of suffering is sin, the human rejection of God, then this therefore needs to be dealt with to truly put an end to suffering. And as Christians, we believe that God has achieved this through the death of Jesus on the cross. When Jesus died on the cross, he took upon himself all of our sins, all the wrong things we have ever done, and he himself suffered, ultimately fulfilling the consequences of our sin, taking the punishment that we all deserve, and thus enabling our sins to be forgiven. Jesus was himself without sin, and he did not deserve to suffer, yet he did so out of love for us, so that we can one day be free from the consequences of sin, and one day live in a world without pain and without suffering. So how do we get to enter into this promise, this hope of one day living in a world without suffering? Well, it's simply by turning away from our sin and putting our trust in Jesus, the one who has defeated sin. The reason we're still waiting for the day to come when God will finally rid the world of all pain and all suffering is that he is waiting himself. Despite the fact that in his perfect love and goodness, he wants nothing more than to right the wrongs of this world. In his kindness, he is patiently waiting for people maybe even you, to turn to him and enter into the hope of the world to come, a world that will be free from pain and suffering and sadness. If we are to turn to God, we need to be aware of our sin, though. We need to be aware that there's a problem in the first place that needs fixing. And being the consequence of our sin, pain and suffering show us our need for healing. They show us our need for saving and our need for God. A Christian writer called Paul Capan puts it like this. He writes, "If God were to remove pain and suffering so that the consequences of sin would be hidden from us, we would live in an illusory world, having the impression that we are doing fine without being reconciled to God. If we did not experience the consequences of sin, we would never be dissatisfied in our state of separation from God. If God is to deliver us from our sin and separation from him, he must make us aware of our sin." Do you get what he's saying here? He's saying that suffering in the world is a bit like symptoms of an illness. If you remove symptoms of an illness without curing it, then you would have no way of knowing that you're sick. He's saying that God allows suffering to continue so that we can be aware that the world and all of us in it are sick with sin. Don't you think it would be quite unloving to not make someone aware of their illness if you knew that they were sick, especially if you also had the cure? It's actually precisely because God is loving that we still live in a world of suffering. It's a very counterintuitive thing for me to say, but if my argument is true, then it's the case. It's precisely because God is loving that we still live in a world of suffering. He wants us to realize that there's a problem with the world and with ourselves so that we can find the solution in him. So the reason that suffering still exists is that God desires for more people to turn to him before he lets the curtain fall on this current world of pain and begins the new one free from all sorrow. That's me attempting to answer the philosophical problem of suffering. And if you need to know in a much shorter length of time now, I'm going to offer you what Christianity says about the experiential problem of suffering. So like I mentioned at the start, I'm all too aware that for many people, the problem of suffering is not really a philosophical or intellectual one, but it's a personal one. You struggle to believe that there is a good and loving God, not because you see suffering out there, but because you yourself have experienced it. How does God respond to our personal tragedies? If the God of the Bible is real, well, why on earth would we want to know him or be close to him? Well, instead of me telling you, I want to briefly show you how God responds to personal suffering. As Christians, we believe that Jesus is God in human form, and we can read about how he faced tragedy in one of the biographical accounts of his life. I want to briefly share a short story from the Bible, which was written down by a guy called John, who was one of Jesus' closest friends and an eyewitness to the events of Jesus' life. So before I read, let me just set the scene. What's happened so far is that a man called Lazarus, who's a friend of Jesus's, has recently died 4 days ago, to be precise. And Lazarus's sisters, one of which is called Mary, they are mourning. We then read this in the Bible. When Mary arrived and saw Jesus, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping and saw the other people wailing with her, a deep anger welled up within him, and he was deeply troubled. "Where have you put him?" he asked them. They told him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. The people who were standing nearby said, "See how much he loved him." What is the reaction of Jesus, of God in human form, to the death of a friend? He is deeply angered and he weeps. Jesus looks at death, he looks at suffering and grief, and he grieves and mourns alongside those who are grieving and mourning. That is the kind of God that we as Christians believe in. When it seems that he doesn't care about your life because he has allowed you to suffer, he's right there with you, mourning at the suffering, wishing it wasn't so, and waiting for the day when he rights every wrong and wipes every tear from our eyes. When we go through suffering in life, we almost always ask the question, why? Why did this happen? In these moments, we think that we want answers to why our specific instance of suffering has occurred. But in reality, that isn't what we need. Answers, even if we could get them, would not make the pain go away. What we need is comfort. God doesn't offer us specific answers to every instance of suffering in our lives, to every cry of why, but he does offer us comfort, what we really need. Now, if you were to read to the end of the story I've shared from the Bible, you would see that Jesus actually ends the suffering in this case by bringing this man Lazarus back to life. And you might think that's a bad example of suffering for me to use then, because in reality, our loved ones don't come back from the dead 4 days after they die. But actually, this resurrection of this man coming back to life points us to what is to come for those who choose to trust in Jesus. A greater resurrection where the death that we will all one day face will be put to an end. In the story that I've shared from the Bible, the suffering lasted for 4 days before the joy of new life came. And even though it will be a longer wait for us, we can have hope that even though we suffer now, if we put our trust in Jesus, one day it will come to an end, to be replaced with joy. The hope of this is a great comfort. In the same story that I've read from, Jesus says this, which is still an invitation to all of us today. Jesus says, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die." We will all suffer to some extent in this life. And when we feel indignant at the existence of suffering, know that it is right to feel this way. It is correct that the world is not meant to be like this. There is a good and powerful and loving God who made it perfect and promises to one day make it perfect again. He loves us, and in the meantime, he mourns with us in our suffering, desiring us to turn away from our sin and come and know life and hope with him. So wherever you're at with belief in God or not, I'd love you to think more about what I've said today. If you're someone who doesn't believe that there is a God, well, let me ask you this. Is how you live in and experience this world of suffering consistent with your intellectual view of the world? Maybe you're someone who is struggling to believe in God to be good, whether that's because of personal suffering or otherwise. Well, I'd really encourage you to keep tuning into the rest of the events this week. There really is genuine hope to be found in Jesus. And maybe think about reading some of the Bible for yourself. I'm sure someone from the Christian Union would love to do that with you. Because in the pages of the Bible, we see who God is, ultimately revealed to us in the person of Jesus. A man who is God, who is loving and powerful, who encounters suffering, and who suffers himself for us. Guys, thanks so much for listening to what I've got to say on this topic today. I hope that it's been interesting. I hope it's been helpful. And I hope that it's maybe even been challenging for some of you. Do please send in your questions if you've got any questions about anything that I've said, maybe something you want me to clarify, or maybe somewhere where you think I'm wrong and you want to bring a question because of that, or anything else you want to ask. Do feel free to do that.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Andrew. That was really insightful. I think at the start when you're talking about not evidence against Christianity, I feel like what you've helped us there to do is rewrite what we like our standpoint on this kind of topic. I feel like lots of people that haven't explored Christianity for themselves kind of have an assumption. So yeah, thanks a lot for that. For kind of showcasing maybe what Christians do believe about this topic, for any non-Christian watchers. And also, like, another point which I just thought was really cool, which just really made me think, was about the symptoms, about the what you said about sin and how suffering and grief is a symptom of sin, and that actually, if that didn't occur, then God isn't loving, because you let us be like that. You said it much more you articulated so much better than me, but I just thought that was really cool. Yeah, so thanks so much for that. We've got some questions coming through.
Great, cool.
Some good ones as well. So we'll just start off with this one. The question is, what about suffering that isn't a result of sin? Like, for example, an earthquake, that isn't a result of maybe messing up in your own personal life.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm really glad someone asked that, because that does force me to clarify some of what I said. So I guess I talked about sin being the cause of suffering, and maybe what I wasn't clear about was I didn't mean that every time we encounter suffering, that's a direct result of a sin that we've committed. That's not what I mean. In the Bible, there's actually an instance when there's a blind man, and the disciples say to Jesus, "Oh, whose sin was it that caused this man to be blind?" And Jesus basically says, "It was nobody's sin that this man's blind." Like, basically, they thought that this man had sinned or his family had sinned, and therefore he's blind. And Jesus is like, "No, that's not how it works." So that's not what I mean when I say sin causes suffering. What I mean is, because sin entered the world at the beginning of time, just after creation, suffering entered the world. So I would say that when you say, "Oh, natural disasters, etc., this is suffering that isn't a result of sin," I would say, well, actually, as Christians, we believe all suffering is a result of sin, but not directly. So it's an indirect result of sin. Yeah. So when we believe Adam and Eve were the first people who chose to reject God and sinned, the results were humans were affected, but also the whole world was affected. Kind of things going wrong and natural disasters and stuff, that's kind of a fallout of sin entering the world. So if you're someone who's going through suffering and you're thinking that I've just told you that the reason you're going through suffering is because you yourself have sinned, that's not what I mean. All of us, yes, all human beings have sinned, but it's not that God is punching us directly with a time of suffering as a direct result for our sin. It's much more indirect. It's just that because human beings have sinned, the world is broken, therefore suffering exists, therefore all of us will inevitably encounter suffering in our lives, whether that's someone dying of cancer, whether that's people being affected by a natural disaster. It doesn't mean it's our fault directly that that's happened.
Okay, cool.
That answers your question. And yeah, I think that was a good question, because I don't think I was clear on that in my talk. So thank you for that.
Hopefully it will. And then here's the next question, which in reading this question, I thought of something myself. It says, why can't he just remove the sin too, as well as the suffering? And so I'll quickly, I'll give it over to you. But I think when we talk about suffering and sin, and you say, "Oh, well, if God's all powerful, you just take it all away." I think the most loving thing that God's done is actually given us a choice. He hasn't made us robots. He hasn't gone, "Oh, look at all these humans I've made, and I'm going to make them all love me, and I'm going to make them all think the same. I'm going to make them all have the same personality, and I'm going to do this and this and that." And so that means they're all going to be robots walking around. And the thing is, he's given us this choice. He's given us our personalities. And in doing that, I just think that's the most loving thing that he could have done. That he loved us so much that he wanted us to have personalities and wanted us to be individuals and wanted us to be unique and wanted us to come to him. Didn't want just an awful authoritarian love, more of a relationship. So that's how I would answer that question. But Andrew, what about you? Should I reiterate the question, or you got
I know, and I think it's okay. But yeah, I thought it was a good answer what you said, Rob. I think the question's a really good question. I think it's very perceptive as well. Perceptive question. I think the short answer I'd give to that question, if he can get rid of suffering, why doesn't he get rid of sin? My short answer would be he will. That's also what the Bible promises us as Christians, that when God will one day get rid of all, he will one day get rid of all sin and all suffering, but that comes at the same time. If we want all sin to be got rid of now, well, actually, where do we, like, that means I have to go too, because I'll be the first person to admit that I'm a sinner and I do bad things. So if God's going to rid the whole world right now, right this instant of sin, like, I'm out of here. I reckon we're all out of here, because
we're all stuffed, basically.
We're all stuffed, basically. Yeah, exactly. The Bible does promise us, though, that anyone who puts their trust in Jesus will one day live in this new world that is to come, which has no suffering. And the Bible tells us that we as human beings we will ourselves be transformed. The world will be transformed, so there's no badness and suffering in it, but we as human beings will be transformed so that we will no longer sin. But the Bible tells us that all happens at the same time in the future. What's happening now is God is urging people to respond to him, to put their faith in Jesus, so that we can one day be in that world where there is no sin and no suffering. If he gets rid of it all right now, then yeah, that's it, really. He's waiting because he wants more people. That's kind of what I was getting at when I was talking about waiting, is that, yeah, if he gets rid of all sin and suffering now, then we're in the new world. But he wants more people to come into the new world, which is why he's waiting, because this is the moment in this life where we have the opportunity to respond, and he wants more people to respond. I hope that makes sense. It's a really good question, and so hopefully what we've said has partially at least answered that.
Yeah, and I'll just say now we're going to do some more questions, but if you've got any more questions that you maybe haven't put into the slide, you can still put them in now, by the way. But anyone in the Christian Union would be happy to talk to you about any of these questions. So please do discuss with whoever invited you, and also do DM our Instagram account. There we have people in CU that their jobs are to reply to you. So yeah, feel free to do that. We'll move on to another question, which is, I think, kind of goes on from what we were just speaking about, really. Just kind of a little nuance on that. But it was like, how do we find comfort or hope when we see suffering of those who aren't Christians? So say if someone's passed away and they weren't a Christian, and we're talking about this new hope that we have in Christ, how do we deal with that grief? Because we know they're kind of where they're going, if you know what I mean.
Okay. Yeah, that's a really, really good question, and a really tough question as well. So let me just clarify the question. Are you essentially asking, if someone we know passes away who's not a Christian, where's the comfort? Is that what? Yeah.
How do we find comfort or hope when those we lose? Oh, the top English. I'm sure it's an English student that's written this. How do we find comfort or hope when we lose someone who isn't a Christian?
Yeah. I'm not going to pretend it's easy. God doesn't promise Christians that their life is going to be easy. In fact, far from it. Christianity is very real about the world that we live in. That's one of the reasons why I think Christianity is true, because it's just so real about the world we live in. Christianity doesn't sugarcoat it. Christianity does tell us that the only way to get to kind of enter into heaven and this new world with God, free from pain and sin and suffering, is to put your trust in Jesus. And if someone who we love didn't do that and passes away, we don't pretend that they have got there, but we are still promised comfort. So even though we will be sad and will mourn, God doesn't want us to not be sad and not mourn. Jesus weeps with these people in this story.
You said that in your talk. Sorry to interrupt, but yeah.
No, that's fine.
To say, that was exactly what I was going to say about him in weeping for people.
Yeah, so God never tells us to not weep. Everything's going to be okay. Wishful, positive thinking. Why are you sad? It's of course you're going to be sad. I think even when people who who we believe, didn't respond to Jesus pass away, there is still the promise of comfort, because the promise is when one day we enter that world, the Bible says, it uses this phrase at the end of the Bible, God will wipe every tear from their eye. There will be no more sadness and sorrow. So even though we might be in heaven, in the new creation, in the new world, and not everyone that we loved is there with us, we're told that we won't be mourning or sorrowful or sad. I don't know how that works. I don't know the mechanics behind it. I wish I did. I wish I could explain exactly how it works. But if we believe God and if we trust him, we can have this faith, this belief that I will no longer be mourning for this person who passed away. I will no longer be sad. That will not be there anymore.
Well,
I don't really know what else to say other than that. It's a really tough.
I think that's a good answer. I think if any of those who are watching who are Christians, take that as, part of your mission statement, that you don't want to see anyone slip through the net in other. I know it's not a great way to say it, but you don't want to see your friends not have the opportunity to come to God and to have this eternal life with him in heaven. So yeah, take that as a good commission. And if you're not a Christian watching, take this as a an opportunity to maybe look into it further, to spur you maybe to look at what the Bible has to say, or what your friends in CU have to say too. We'll ask. I think maybe do two more questions. We have a question here saying, why do we need God to know that suffering is bad? Why can't we just know from experience? That's
Yeah, really good question. Again, that's just helping me to maybe clarify something I said in my talk. So I guess that's going back to how I was talking about kind of, we see the world, we know it's right and wrong, or we perceive it as right and wrong, we perceive good and evil, and we perceive these things to be kind of objective, like, well, I would say these things are definitely always right, these things are definitely always wrong. So I think the question is saying, why do we need God to know it's not right and wrong? We don't need God to know something's right or wrong. So that's not what I meant in my argument. I absolutely agree that we do not need to believe in God to perceive things as right and wrong, to know things are right and wrong. That's absolutely correct. What I meant was, there has to be a God. Well, my argument is, and this is the kind of the Christian view of the world, that philosophically speaking, whether or not we believe in a God, we can perceive right and wrong. But actually, we require some sort of God for objective moral values to exist. I don't know if that makes sense. So it's kind of like, that's what I was saying about kind of, if we don't believe there's a God, so kind of like atheists would say, there's no God, we're just spinning atoms. That's the thing I was saying about, like, everything happens by chance. We've got to just, why do bad things happen? They just do. Why do good things happen? They just do. Why does suffering happen? We just got to shrug our shoulders and get on with it. That would be a consistent atheist view of the world. So my point kind of was that actually, if you're someone who says, I don't believe in God, but you recognize right and wrong, you recognize good and evil, I would just want to kind of gently nudge you and say, I think the way you live is inconsistent with the way you think. Because I don't think that we can have objective moral values. This is definitely right, this is definitely wrong, this is good, this is evil, if all there is to this world is just the material world. Like, why? What is your reason? What is your explanation for saying something is, an innocent child gets killed? How can you say that is, what is your basis for saying that is objectively wrong and evil? Mine is, there's a God who gives us the standard of right and wrong, which is defined by him and his character. What's your explanation? I don't think there is one, if you want to be consistent. So to kind of summarize that, because I've gone on a little bit, no, we don't need to believe in God to recognize right and wrong, but I think we do need to have a God in existence for there to be a right and wrong.
I think that makes sense. You saying that kind of just made me think of another way to look at it is, when you think of beauty, I know it's different from what we're talking about today, but everyone on this planet has an innate sense of what beauty is. So you might look at a sunrise and think that's beautiful. How you can't explain why you have that feeling of knowing that something's beautiful. And if you're saying then that then there's no God and there's nothing greater, then why do you have that knowledge that something's beautiful? That's not random, and everyone has it. So that could be another thing to think about when you're thinking about these hard topics. Why don't you go outside for a walk and think about the beautiful things as well? There's lots of things to think about. Last question, which I think we've already slightly touched on, but we can look at, is are natural disasters a result of Adam and Eve's sin? Can we say that?
Yeah, I guess it's similar to what we've asked before, but maybe slightly different. So yeah, let's go with it. Basically, there's, from what I'm aware of, within the Christian worldview, how Christians understand the world, I've come across two different explanations for natural disasters, and I don't know which one's true. I don't know which one I go with. I don't think it matters, because as long as we can show that there are explanations that are consistent, I think that's the important thing. Anyway, so there's two reasons I think I'm aware of. So number one is similar to what I've kind of hinted at before, is that some Christians would say the world was perfect and did not have natural disasters. It didn't have tsunamis and earthquakes and volcanoes erupting, etc., etc. But like I say, the Bible tells us that when Adam and Eve sinned, the whole world was affected, like creation, nature, everything was like negatively affected. Some Christians would say, therefore, natural disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis, etc., came about. It's kind of like an expression of the world being broken, if that makes sense. So like an indirect consequence of human sinning. It's not like, obviously we can't draw a direct link between like, I did something wrong, therefore there's an earthquake. That's silly. But I would say like indirectly, because humans have sinned, God has made the negative effects of sin affect the whole world. Now natural disasters exist. That's one theory. The other theory is that things like earthquakes and tsunamis and volcanoes, etc., were always part of the world, and it's not that the world has gone wrong to make these things happen, but it's just that we as humans now are affected by them. So it's a bit more hard to understand, but it's like a tsunami is only a bad thing if there are people there to be affected by it. An earthquake's only a bad thing if you build houses on a fault line or near a fault line, for example. Yeah. They're not bad in and of themselves. They're really bad if humans are there. And some Christians have the theory that, well, so animals, for example, some animals in nature have been observed, apparently, I'm not a biologist, but I've just heard, apparently can sense when natural disasters are happening. And there have been instances recorded of animals kind of fleeing from areas days or hours before a natural disaster happened. So some Christians have the theory that as humans, we are not as we are meant to be, because we have sinned and our human nature is kind of less than it was meant to be. And actually, if we had never sinned, if human beings were the fullness of our human nature was meant to be, we would also have these kind of intuition or senses, so to speak. So I have heard some Christians say, oh no, in the new creation, in the new world, there'll still be volcanoes erupting, there'll still be earthquakes, and there'll still be tsunamis, but we will be these renewed human beings who are also able to kind of sense when they're happening, and they just won't negatively affect us.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's two different understandings of natural disasters within Christian thought. I don't really know which one I believe, but at least there are some potential explanations.
Yeah, I'm a geographer, so I would be veering to the second one. Yeah, that's very interesting. Well, guys, thank you for your questions. It's actually been really good to hear from people at home getting involved with the Slido. And if you have been challenged by what we've been speaking about, please do reach out to the person who brought you here today. I know I've mentioned it like so many times before, but please do. Or get in contact with us on Facebook or Instagram at @Elborough_CU. We're really happy to explore a bit of what the Bible says with you. We have Uncover Mark, which is a book which I do not have to hand, but if you'd like to explore what Mark says, with a member of the Christian Union, we'd be more than happy to do that. So for the rest of the week, we've got amazing events. Tomorrow we have facts and figures. Can God be added to the equation? So I'm sure lots of you STEM students would be having loads of figures going around your head with your degree or whatever you're doing at this moment in time. So that will be a good talk for you. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the open mic night and other lunch bars throughout the week. It's going to be a great time. And lastly, if any of the topics we brought up today and you have lost someone dear to you recently, we'd love to, as a Christian Union, pray for you, or go for a walk, or have a chat, to be our sense of community in Loughborough CU, to help you through this time. So please do get in contact with me through my Instagram or through Loughborough, the Loughborough CU Instagram, because we'd love to chat to you. We'd love to tell you how through Jesus we can get over these things which are really tough. So thanks again to Andrew for speaking to us, and we will see you all very soon, hopefully tomorrow or within the week. See you guys.